And from there, of course, I went to Worcester College, and I spent a year there in the Department of Religion and Philosophy, and from there to Colgate University in New York. Spent 2 years there in the Department of Religion and Philosophy. 1984, I came to Vanderbilt, the fall of '84, and I spent 29.5 years teaching in the Religious Studies Department at Vanderbilt. For some 40 years now, I've been involved in King Scholarship, scholarship on the life, thought, and activities of Martin Luther King, Jr. I've written about 6 books on Dr. King, edited 2, co-edited 2, co-authored 2, for a total of 12 books. So for the last 40 years, I've been involved in Martin Luther King Jr. scholarship.
You are, in a real sense, Dr. Martin Luther King, reincarnated, or
Thank
whatever,
you.
etc.
Thank you.
Dr. Baldwin, let's talk about the Confederate monuments. That is to sort of lay down the topic for the first 2 minutes of next 2 minutes before we have our second commercial break.
Okay.
And remind our audience that you also talked about the Confederacy itself and the Confederate Constitution, et cetera. Pull that information in when you talk about those monuments.
Yes, the last time I was here, I talked about the Confederate flag and the debate swirling around
and bring all
the
of that
Confederate flag.
in.
But now, since August the 12th, and I think you remember that date, the violent confrontation in Charlottesville, Virginia, between neo-Nazis, Klansmen, and counter-protesters. And I think that encounter on August 12th, 2017, actually triggered this debate around Confederate monuments. And we have to understand the history of those monuments. Right after the Civil War ended in 1865, there was really no attempt to engage in a massive campaign for the erection of these kinds of monuments. In fact, most of them were erected between the 1890s and the 1960s. The 1890s, you have the black codes, Jim Crow laws being put into place. And of course, there was a reaction to that, keeping blacks from voting, that kind of thing. So you get, from the 1890s on, the erection of Confederate monuments. Through the 1920s with the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. And we don't see these monuments being erected on a mass scale after that time until the 1950s and 60s when the Civil Rights Movement started. And of course, it occurred as a backlash to what was going on with Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. So since August 12th of this year, we've had this debate since the events in Charlottesville about whether or not these monuments should be dismantled, put into historical museums. There are all kinds of questions about whether or not they should exist.
Okay, so let's take this first commercial break, and then we'll come back and pick up. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Louis Baldwin, and the topic is Confederate monuments. And so, Doctor, let's start at the beginning and give you an opportunity to start now to talk about the origin of these monuments and et cetera and et cetera.
Okay, now these monuments originated to really celebrate the Confederacy, to celebrate Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee, Confederate generals, Confederate soldiers, Confederate states. And as you well know, there were 11 states that broke with the Union. So these monuments emerged primarily to celebrate people like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and others. They also emerged as a kind of white backlash to civil rights activities, initiatives, etc. So the argument today, of course, the arguments, I think, run along two lines. First of all, those who are in favor of the preservation of these monuments argue that they represent history. They represent the culture of the past. They represent Southern pride. Because if you look at the location of these monuments, most of them are in the South. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, some 1,500 of these monuments exist today, and that includes statues, that includes schools and parks and other institutions named after Confederate soldiers, Confederate leaders. They represent a celebration of certain Confederate states, and most of them are in Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia. But there are some 1,500 of them, and 700 of that 1,500 are actually statues that stand as memorials to people who were involved in the Confederacy. But the argument, I think, is that they represent history, they represent heritage, they represent the culture of the past, but then you have those who are opposed to these monuments who say that they actually represent white supremacy. I remember reading Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? And he talks about how they represent a kind of master race ethos. There's also the argument that they celebrate slavery and segregation, that they divide the nation. And I think that's the most important argument because, as you well know, we are very much divided as a nation today. So these monuments, the debate that started August 12th with the Charlottesville events, which involved the murder of Heather Heyer, who was killed by one of these neo-Nazis. That debate has gone on, and I think it's reached fever pitch since that time. So the whole question is, where do we go from here?
And now these monuments, not only do they stand alone, I think you've indicated that, but you also find small statuettes of them located. And there's something in Tennessee. What about the state of Tennessee when we think about these monuments?
If you look at Tennessee, I was reading recently an article about Knoxville. You don't find a lot of monuments in Knoxville because we have to understand that East Tennessee remained part of the Union.
Okay.
It didn't separate from the Union. So you don't find a lot of these monuments in the eastern part of Tennessee. But they are in Tennessee, in the state capitol. You have Nathan Bedford Forrest. There's been a lot of debate recently. I think the Black Caucus in the state legislature has called for the removal of Nathan Bedford Forrest's bust from the state capitol. And of course, the Metro Council has put out a statement against white supremacy. Certain churches, even the Southern Baptist Convention, has put out a statement against white supremacy. So this debate has spilled over, obviously, into Tennessee. And you have the same scenario that you have in other parts of the country with people who stand for these monuments and people who stand against them.
And it's almost like the Confederate flag. You just can't get away from it.
Exactly. The Confederate flag is very much a part of this debate because it too stands as a symbol of the Confederacy. But my problem is this: the Confederacy died. It was an attempt to establish a separate political nation, and it fizzled out. It didn't succeed. With the defeat of the Confederacy in April 1865 and the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant and the Union forces, we know that the Confederacy died. So why are we celebrating it? The Confederacy was an attempt to divide the United States, not unite us. And I think as long as these monuments stand, these statues, parks and schools and churches and other institutions named after Confederate generals and leaders and soldiers, as long as these monuments stand, they will divide Americans.
You know, the last time you were here, we talked about the Confederate flag. And I think one of the things that you mentioned was that Robert E. Lee probably did not agree with some of the thoughts in reference to bringing that flag out and using that flag. What do you think that he would have thought of himself being the subject of one of these large monuments in the park like it was in Virginia?
I don't think Robert E. Lee, especially toward the end of his life, you read, thought in terms of dividing Americans. I think he had some regrets about what happened in terms of the Confederacy and its rebellion against the United States. So it's hard to say what he would think today, but I think he would be rather disturbed because he is viewed with a mixture of praise and disdain. There are those who praise and celebrate him, and there are those who reject his image and who feel that he represented something very dark, to put it that way, in our history. So, you know, not only Robert E. Lee, but others who were involved. Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, so many others. One wonders what they would think about this controversy, about this debate going on today around Confederate monuments.
You mentioned the number in terms, say that again in reference to how prevalent these are throughout the nation.
Yes, well, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are roughly 1,500 monuments, statues, streets named after Confederate leaders, etc. But 700 of those are actually statues.
Statues themselves.
They're statues themselves. And I always think, is it possible for us to actually get rid of these? I don't think so.
I don't think so either, because they're so prevalent.
Yes, I think
so much opposition.
There will always be these symbols. In parts of Alabama, certain towns have vowed to not only hold on to the Confederate monuments they have, but to create others.
Very good. So let me take this second commercial break, Dr. Baldwin. We'll be back. And we'll be back with our audience following this second commercial break.